Okay, welcome to the second hour of Kwok Talk. I'm Crystal, and we are going to be talking about some issues. Again, we can say it's rare because people don't talk about it, but is it rare? No, it absolutely is in your face in Hong Kong. The problems and issues with migrant workers, and the angle today is probably with their children that are born in Hong Kong. And so how do we all look at migrant workers in Hong Kong? I've got a co-founder and executive director of PathFinders. We've got Kylie Uebergang. Did I pronounce that right, Kylie?
Kylie Uebergang. Yep, that's pretty good.
Welcome, Kylie, and thank you for coming on. Let's talk about what the PathFinders is something that you co-founded. Let's hear what this is all about first.
So PathFinders is an organisation that started about 4 years ago in response to what we were seeing happening in society, which was migrant women becoming pregnant, for the most part unexpectedly pregnant, and becoming pregnant with mixed-race children out of wedlock. And what we were finding is that they were falling below the safety nets. They were becoming hidden in society, really voiceless in society. And when that happens for an adult, she becomes very vulnerable. But can you imagine when that happens to a child? And then the mother, for instance, we were finding cases where the mother didn't have any options, so she would leave the baby in Chungking mansions in a room while she'd have to go out and search for food and work.
Right.
So how do you know to go looking for that baby if it was born undocumented without a birth certificate, and its mother was shamed to tell people she had a baby that was mixed race and out of wedlock?
Oh, boy.
And these sort of situations alerted us to the fact that this was not 5 or 10 or 100. This was happening to hundreds and hundreds of women every year.
Right.
And as time goes on, if they don't come out of hiding and into the safety networks that are available, then they just live and their children don't get the opportunities.
They can't go to schools. They can't
seek medical attention.
Right.
They often don't have enough food to eat. Often they're homeless. If the mother falls pregnant again, she considers and often and goes with self-induced abortion. Mothers, you've seen it in the newspapers, they do abandon babies, they do put them in trash cans, they do put them in places just because they don't know what else to do. So as we've been in this space for the last 4 years and connecting with other organisations that help distressed women or help migrant women or help pregnant women, we are seeing a huge number of these women and babies in Hong Kong.
Wow. I mean, that's a big issue. And I have a personal issue I'd like to share with you. Actually, that you brought that out, is that I do have a helper who is pregnant. And in fact, this is her last week because we were just toying with the idea of when she wants to take off. But she's the one who wants to keep working because she feels like she doesn't want to be staying in her home little room for, 6 weeks by herself doing nothing. So let me just give you a little background on her information. Yeah. She's been in my helper for 6 years, so, I take care of her. And last summer, she gives me a call, and I'm in Beijing with my kids, and I hear she's pregnant. And, of course, my kid's like, oh, who's the father? My youngest ones would figure something like that out to ask. And so she's a single mom. She had some fling during the summer, and she decided she wanted to keep the baby because she's getting older now and she wants to keep it. So all these questions come out, and you're the perfect person to tell me what, not to seek help, but just for people to realize that it is an issue in Hong Kong. She tells me she decides she wants to have her baby born in Hong Kong because the care in Hong Kong is better than the Philippines. So that's her choice. I support her through it. And then she plans to probably bring the baby back to the Philippines and have hopefully some relative to look after him or her. And then she comes back to work again.
Perfect. And that is a solution that can be found if the employer and the employee have some flexibility. And it's increasingly, because I am looking for stories like this, I'm hearing stories like this. And sometimes the employer doesn't know what to do in terms of, the maternity leave and how that's all going to work. But it's actually in legislation how it all works. And there is in maternity leave entitlements, as you or I, if we were migrants in Hong Kong or working with any organisation, actually, as
Can you
part of the
briefly go
employment.
Through that so people are aware of what the situation is?
Absolutely. And our first point of call is always to make sure that the baby and the mum are safe, they're out of danger, and that they have health access, that they can go to a hospital and have health checks and things like that. Then the next stage is, well, what about your employment situation? Is your employer understanding? Have you told your employer about this? You have certain obligations under the law to tell your employer about this. And if you do tell your employer about this and comply with, giving a maternity notice or giving a doctor's certificate, things like that, then your employer has an obligation to look after you through that period, whether it be financially or hold your job or both.
Right.
And in your case, it's fantastic because you're working out with the helper when's the best time for her to go back, when, can the family in the Philippines take care of the child so she can continue working.
Right.
And that's a huge thing for the people that we work with. How can they raise their children and sustain the livelihood so that they can raise their children in the future? And if she loses her job, and in a place like Hong Kong where she only gets 2 weeks to find a new job, it is virtually impossible to find a new job when you're pregnant.
Absolutely.
And I think that probably spans all sectors, but particularly domestic workers, for instance.
But in the old days, but just not even that long ago, wasn't there no rules to help support the workers? If your helper said they were pregnant, they would be shipped back to the first thing.
That's just the unofficial practice.
Okay.
Or the official practice, as the case may be. It's always been in the law that there is entitlements, but it is very common, nevertheless, for once someone becomes pregnant, their employer to just wash their hands of the situation and ask them to leave.
Right.
And what these women are facing is the fact that they are single mothers coming from conservative societies with mixed-race children who look different to them. So it's not an easy fit for the home community. So it's not an easy fit of, okay, I've lost my job, I'm going to go home and have the baby and come back. A lot of women are too terrified to go home barefoot and pregnant, so to speak.
Right.
So they choose to overstay their visa.
Okay.
And once they overstay their visa, they're what we call undocumented. They can't work in Hong Kong, and this is when they can't access medical services.
So they wouldn't even give birth in a hospital, are you saying?
What Hong Kong is wonderful at is it will take someone in an emergency, any person in an emergency, but it won't take someone in terms of the prenatal care or the antenatal care required throughout the pregnancy. So if there is any problems, they can walk up to emergency. But in terms of preparing for the birth and getting just the general issues going through the pregnancy, they can't access that at all. And I think, your helper is probably right. I mean, Hong Kong is a very first-class medical system, particularly compared to other parts of Asia.
So my question, though, is after a migrant worker gives birth or chooses to give birth here and is documented, what happens? Yes. What is the rights that the child have?
The child does not. The child basically inherits the rights of their parents. So your migrant worker does not have right of abode in Hong Kong, and that child will not have right of abode in Hong Kong. But your migrant worker has a working visa, of which you are the sponsor, and likewise you can apply for the child to be a dependent of that working visa. So the child can stay here for the period of the mother. Now,
as long as she's working?
As long as she's working, yes. And this is where we have been seeing with the right of abode cases in the newspapers recently. In instance where that happens and the child has lived here for 7 years, so continuous visas, they then become entitled to right of abode.
Right.
Up until the current date of where the hearings are at, and that's, of course, in the Court of Appeal at the moment. And I think the only thing to highlight also, going back to where you first started with this, is that it's illegal to fire your helper because she's pregnant.
Right. That's the first thing I checked on. And not that I wanted to, but I just needed to know.
What are your obligations?
Right.
Because you don't really get told that, or you don't have to think about that when you first employ someone.
No.
And it's not until that is literally in your home that it becomes highly relevant. And if you do fire your helper because she becomes pregnant, she has an avenue of appeal for that through the Labour Tribunal. And what we are finding is that avenue is there and it's strong and it's open, but a lot of helpers don't know to access it. The employers who are of the character to fire their helper because she's pregnant don't encourage the helper to take any action. And we're increasingly seeing that helpers from places like Indonesia just don't know how to assert their rights because they don't have those sort of rights at home.
Right.
And they're already in this very mixed up foreign situation trying to do the best they can.
Sure.
So they really don't take the avenues that are available.
And it's quite interesting what lack of support there is for their situation. I was just talking to some girl at some event the other day and about my situation, and I'm joking about it. I'm like, hey, yeah, my maid's pregnant and she's going to be giving birth very soon. And she was like, well, so what? You have no obligation to take care of her. Why should you just, it's not your fault that she's pregnant. And it was quite mean. And I'm thinking, well, she's a woman. This is her life she's chosen for herself. She's an adult. And she's been
with me for 6 years.
Exactly.
She's raised my family.
And why should I not care how she's going to take care of her baby?
Yeah.
Am I not, it's just quite, it's quite sad.
And that's one of the issues I think that we face in Hong Kong, because another option for your maid, for instance, would be that should she really not be able to take the baby home, not have a supportive family at home, and should she have an employer here who really cannot, the baby cannot live with the employer as well, she can consider adoption in Hong Kong.
Right.
And that is, increasingly available to migrants. When we first started 4 years ago, it was very difficult to get children into social welfare's adoption pool.
Why is that?
The perception was, take your baby home. It's not our problem.
Okay.
And so we went back to case law that showed that back in the Vietnamese boat refugees days, that children were born and they were being adopted in Hong Kong. And the case law set out that for the purposes of adoption, all children born in Hong Kong, can be adopted, basically. They're residents for that purpose only. Whereas otherwise, to be a resident of Hong Kong, you need to have, a mother or a father of Chinese descendancy or a permanent resident of Hong Kong. That's the only way you will get right of a boat otherwise. And so learning that, we have been opening doors in social welfare. And, of course, social welfare is a network of different layers in order to get children into that final state where they are placed with new adoptive permanent parents. But what we are having to do is that at the ground level, that can be in a hospital, that can be in an integrated family service centre, IFSC, that can be just walking into a social welfare counter anywhere. It's letting those people know, those people who have that attitude you were talking about before of, you don't have to look after these people.
Right.
Every one of them needs to understand, actually, we do need to look after these people. These people came here on valid visas. They worked with us in our community. They're single women. They're unsupported. And they only lost their job because they became pregnant.
Right.
And if you were in that situation, or if I was in that situation, I would be demanding that support.
Yeah.
So it's been a bit of an education process, and I think it will be an ongoing education process to have people understand that it's actually in their interests to help these women through this. How
do you go about doing that through your cause, though?
Through our cause, we break it down into, obviously, programs that focus on the mum and on the baby, getting them out of danger, getting them safe, getting them thinking about their long term, getting them home.
But they need to come to you to begin with, so...
Yes.
How do they even take that first step?
That first step has been done for us. That is the legs of referrals.
Okay.
You help 5 people and they bring 15 people. And we've always basically responded to the demand in the market. And as we grow, we can respond to more demand. And as we got an office and as we opened a shelter and as we...
Are there shelters?
We have a shelter as well. And, that would have been an option, for instance, for your helper, which we can talk about in a minute. But I think once you help someone that's been through that tremendously complex, difficult situation, they want to help by referring other people into that network.
Right.
And for a lot of these women who come here, in a way, they didn't get to choose to come here. It was a choice their families or their communities made. So next thing you know, they're working with an agency who doesn't appear to have their best interests in hand a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Next thing you know, they're in a home where they can't speak the language fully and they don't fully understand the expectations of what the family is. So there's been all these steps to get to them to the point where they really don't know who to reach out to and who to ask for help. So when you find an organisation that's offering that, that's trying to bring it all together, that's trying to connect them to Mother's Choice and trying to connect them to Helpers for Domestic Helpers and really help them assert their rights, they are so grateful and they are very resilient ladies. And then they've been our outreach service, they've been our network.
Good.
And going back to the shelter, some of the solutions that we've found is that because obviously you're going to face a period without a helper. Because in Hong Kong, you can't employ a part-time helper. And that makes life very difficult when you're having helpers go on maternity leave.
Right.
So one of the solutions that we had, because, you know, the mums want to keep the job, the employers want to keep the people that are working well in the family, so everyone wants to protect that employment situation. So we had one mum who basically, for the period really leading up to the birth, she stayed with the family, did light duties, just stuff that worked for the family and her, but just gave some support.
Yes.
And then she came once the baby was born, and the baby and her came and lived in our shelter. And then her mum came over from the Philippines and basically nursed the baby with her. So she would be able to do light duties with the employer.
So the shelter actually supported and housed the mother who came over also.
Yeah, and she looked after the baby. And obviously there was a period where the mother fully nursed that child, and it was negotiated with the employer then as to how long that period was and what worked for both parties. And because the mother was mobile and was able to come over, that really helped the helper come to terms with the fact that she couldn't have a long extended maternity leave because it was her mother who was ultimately going to be raising that child while she continues working in Hong Kong.
So the mother took the baby back to...
So after the 2 months, the mother took the baby back to the Philippines, and now that family's in a situation where 300,000 other women are in Hong Kong, that their family is in another country and that they're working here to support their family.
It's a vicious cycle though, isn't it?
It is a vicious cycle, but it's a necessary cycle if these women want to earn foreign income.
Right.
And that is, you know, when they come from societies where it is very much a collective societal development. It's not, you know, this is my house, my home, my food. This is the community, like particularly if I'm talking central Indonesia and places like that. So there is a lot of pride in being able to support your community.
True.
So it's almost a personal sacrifice for that community pride.
But I think we touched on some issues that we're reversing the perspective on this, because a lot of people, you know, I don't know about you, but I think that Hong Kong is quite discriminating when it comes down to domestic helpers. We're looking down on them, and that's why we don't want to help them, and maybe we should talk about that and understanding where they're coming from. So after a quick break, maybe we talk about what is it, if you were in their shoes, and maybe all the other details and issues and support choices we have in Hong Kong, because people don't. It's sad that we don't talk about things that we think don't concern us. And then we bring it out and it's like, oh, gee, that's sad.
And sometimes it can be simple solutions too, where there's win-win situations.
Let's hear about it after a quick break.
Yeah. Soldier, don't give a damn. She's getting over. She knows she
Lenny Kravitz. And now it's time for the quick news report, but quickly, weather forecast for this afternoon. It's 15 degrees right now, and relative humidity is 88%. Stay tuned, and after a quick break, we will be talking again about migrant workers.
The government has released new information about a design competition at the centre of a conflict of interest row involving Chief Executive candidate C.Y. Leung. He's been accused of failing to declare a link between his company and one of the competitors in a design contest for the West Kowloon Arts Hub in 2002. But it's now emerged that he was not the only juror to consistently vote for that particular design. Altus Wong has details.
The government had earlier released Mr. Leung's voting records, which showed that he had voted for a Malaysian firm's design 5 times out of the 6 rounds of competition. His staff members had provided that company with land pricing information, but did not charge for it. Mr. Leung has said he was not aware of any connection between the firm and his own company, DTZ, until after he voted. Now the government's released the voting records of the other jurors as well, revealing that the Malaysian firm's design had received a similar level of support from another juror. The administration said it did not consider it necessary for the LASHCO to invoke its special powers to investigate the controversy, as it would be willing to cooperate with council members to look into the matter.
Chief Executive hopeful Regina Yip is scrambling for last-minute nominations to join the election race ahead of a 5 o'clock deadline this afternoon. Mrs Yip refused to tell reporters how many nominations she has in hand, but admitted that she's failed to secure any from the DAB party and only 1 from the Federation of Trade Unions. She needs a minimum of 150 nominations. And in the US, Mitt Romney has narrowly won the Michigan Republican presidential primary. The former Massachusetts governor defeated Rick Santorum, who'd waged a hard-fought battle for the state. Earlier, Mitt Romney also won the primary in the state of Arizona. Next news at 3.
An international station for an international city. This is Radio 3.
outside school business to say, and I enjoy blogging, and I used to produce a podcast before I got too busy with schoolwork.
Your artist.
Hi, I'm Avril Lavigne.
Hey, I'm Trong. This is Calvin Harris.
Hey there, this is Adam Lambert.
Hi, this is Shane from Westlife.
What's up? This is Mike Posner.
Hey, we're Paramore.
Your music.
I'm sexy and I know it. It's Tune Time with me, Alison Howe. Monday to Friday, 9 to 10 p.m. right here on RTHK Radio 3.
Okay, back on Kwok Talk, and I'm talking to Kylie here from the PathFinders, and very interesting material talking about migrant women and their children. Let's talk about their children. I mean, what happens to the migrant workers in Hong Kong who decide to have a child here? Legally, of course, you were saying that if they were born in a hospital and it's legitimate, sure,
Yes.
they're recognized, but
Yes.
some of them that don't, and they're just off on the side in the street, God knows what.
Yes.
But what is the support, and where do the school systems come in place?
Well, I think there's no school opportunities for children under 6 in Hong Kong, right?
Right.
In terms of any preschool education, it's all private. So what we've found recently was one of our clients had a 12-year-old daughter who had never been to school. She doesn't have a birth certificate. She's undocumented. You can't even prove that that's her mother. Now, she's been living in Hong Kong since she was born. And, you know, what obligation does Hong Kong have in terms of educating that child? What opportunities should that child be able to access here? And in this particular case, you know, you really do need to look at the circumstances of the mother as well, because when you get to the fact that your child is 12 years old and you have not pursued education opportunities for your child,
Right.
that is a situation of neglect and
Absolutely.
abuse. And in that case, the mother actually ended up in prison.
Oh.
And it's still an ongoing case, so I can't say too much about it. But what we're finding with the smaller kids, obviously a mother gets pregnant, she loses her job or overstays her visa, the child is born. Now, when it's a baby, you know, the most important thing for the child is not space and cognitive development and things like that. But as the child gets 1, 2, and 3, they need opportunities to grow and develop. And what we recognize, or what we're seeing with these mothers who otherwise live in very crowded situations, they usually don't have their own money to pay rent, so they stay with friends in hostels or with you know, a bunch of guys that take them in or something like that. And the child is up all night. The child doesn't have anywhere to play. The child doesn't have any...
There's no structure in their life.
There is nothing. And that's when the mothers really start looking at, well, you know, I thought this was the best for the child, but now actually that I have a healthy, glowing young boy who's 18 months old who just wants to run and play, and I can't do it in Hong Kong, taking the child home, like sometimes that gives her the confidence she needs to go home and face this community at home with this child that's out of wedlock and mixed race. And what we offer at PathFinders, in recognizing that these mums want exactly the same as what I want for my daughter and what you want for your children. They want opportunities to let them expand their mind and to reach their potential. And those opportunities are from the very smallest to the very largest, right? And every time I talk to a mum about the types of services she wants child development. She wants kids to join playgroups. She wants to understand what she should be teaching her child, what she should be looking out for.
You're right.
She wants to know what how you sound out the alphabet and things like that. So we're responding to that. We're responding to what the mums want, and we're running playgroups. And if any volunteers would like to come and work in our playgroups,
milk it. Tell us, how do we look for you?
We need people who can regularly commit, like on a Saturday morning, to come and be part of this adventure.
Yes.
And certainly volunteers run across all spectrums of what we do. And this morning I was just saying I was in a forum talking about social media, and that's a whole new level of where volunteers can be helpful in terms of getting the stories out there and connecting the stories with other positive stories, and really getting the passion that we operate and that we respond to every day into the wider community. So there's some of the areas. And what was the other question you were going to ask?
You're asking me? You're throwing it back at me. Well, I was going to talk about something else if you can't remember that.
Yep.
We mentioned this discrimination earlier. Hong Kong being that place. Not only do Chinese discriminate against our own people, but there's a real look down on migrant workers. And again, what you just said about a woman wanting the best for their child. People don't even think like that. They think, oh, your helpers, they're just going to have, they get themselves in trouble, and then they're just going to go off and run around in the fields and just not have an education anyway. So there's nothing we can do.
One of the stories that amazed me, and this happened more than once, but the first time was most mind-boggling, was that a helper could be working in someone's home and be 8.5 months, nearly 9 months pregnant, and the family not know.
What?
And I think that must mean that family never looks at their helper.
Yes.
And they never noticed that she started walking differently. They never noticed that her tummy got bigger. They never noticed that she held her back, Right. They never noticed any of that because they don't look at her. And what does that tell you about the relationship in that family?
It's a very important point.
I don't think that's an isolated case. And we've certainly had cases before where, literally we get referred to the client in hospital. The hospital quite often calls. And the hospital also calls the employer. And then we're often the first people on the scene with the employer facing this. And they will say, we didn't know she was pregnant.
Oh, gosh.
Now, obviously, the helper has also gone to lengths to not let that be shown.
Right.
But she's 9 months pregnant.
Oh, please.
So I think there are many issues there. And I think, people do live in very confined small spaces in Hong Kong, and helpers are therefore part of that space. And you have to work out your own coping mechanisms as to how to have a stranger in your house that is technically not part of your family, yet is treated as, in some ways, as part of your family. How do you keep your privacy? And maybe not looking at her is one way of doing that. So I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt there. But nevertheless,
they're people too, and you work with them. They're helping your children grow, and it's just everything.
And if you were born in the Philippines, it could be your mother that's coming into someone else's
Let's
house.
Put it in their shoes. What would you do?
Yeah, and you would expect that they would understand that if your mother was pregnant, things would be changing with her, and the family would need to accommodate that.
I'm going to tell you back with my helper. I remember when she told her family, her father was in shame. He did not want her to bring the child back, but her mother was supportive and says, "No, you don't listen to that man. You bring him back." It was very, so it's real. You're going to have that in whatever situation you are. I have friends who are so racist that they can't even, accept a relative with a boyfriend from some other culture. Let's talk about sex workers, because a lot of times maybe you're always assuming with that situation that there are a lot of consequences that result in more of these children. Do they come to you?
Yes. So we serve all migrant women in Hong Kong, all unsupported migrant women. And a lot of people ask us, well, does that mean you support mainland mothers as well? And I said, we would. If there was an unsupported mainland migrant mother that was living in Hong Kong, we would definitely support her. But they don't. And I think, there's a whole spectrum of what happens with mainland mothers that doesn't necessarily touch on the clients that we work with.
Yeah, they're getting enough press.
But what we find is that women come to Hong Kong from places like Africa, Colombia, Sri Lanka, Israel, from everywhere basically, on tourist visas. And at some point, whether they preempt it or whether they just fall into it because there's no other options, that's working in the sex industry does become part of how they sustain themselves. Now, that leads to pregnancy. Not always, but it often leads to pregnancy. Sure. And what is often the quick fix there is that there is a thriving illegal abortion clinic network in Hong Kong. And you can just turn up to one of those clinics on any day of the week, pay your $3,500 and it's done that day.
And they're safe? And
Of course they're not safe, but they are a quick fix. And to be honest, they're cheap. In the scheme of things, it costs $3,500 to get an abortion in the public hospitals anyway. And unfortunately, we've heard of situations where that goes very wrong, and because they will take risks because the mother's asking them to, and they will abort children up to 6 months and things like that. But nevertheless, I think that a lot of situations where sex workers do get into trouble, there are pills, there are, if they're not new kids on the block, they can deal with it themselves. Now, we have had clients who have come to us who they don't advertise that they're sex workers, but as time goes on and the relationship with them deepens, your perception is that that's a form of the transaction.
Do they end up going back to work often in these cases?
Yes. So a few of the ladies that we have had, they have ultimately adopted their children in Hong Kong, and so for them, given that they've found themselves in this industry and they've chosen that they're not going to go home, the option of taking the child home or keeping the child with them because of what they do is out of the question.
Right.
So adoption has been an option for them.
Got it.
And certainly in Hong Kong residents or Chinese residents, or it's not uncommon that sex workers will adopt their children out. And then other cases, what I'm also educating myself on is the fact that what I may see as a sex transaction and a relationship that is a transaction is very different to how other cultures may perceive that, particularly when you come from cultures where you have arranged marriages. So your whole life becomes a transaction.
Right.
You don't choose who your partner is.
Right.
You get told who your partner is. Your partner tells you when to have sex with him. You get told then to go overseas and work. So then to turn around and say to these people, but that guy gave you money after having sex. I mean, it's just a transaction.
Right.
It's a transaction that it's just another transaction in a very long life of transactions. So the whole culture of relationships can be quite different.
Yeah.
And whether it might be payment in the form of a nice dinner or payment in the form of cash or whatever, there's a huge spectrum in any society, and particularly in Hong Kong.
And they're the real victims because they don't really know what they're getting into. It wasn't by choice. So there are a lot of issues there. So about these women, whether they're from, like you said, a forced marriage or sex workers or domestic helpers, when they're in this predicament and they are pregnant and they have to deal with their children, what financial support is there in Hong Kong for them?
Once they've overstayed their visa, there is no ability for them to work in Hong Kong legally.
You can't even reapply when you have to get out to come back in, right?
Yeah, but if you've overstayed your visa, you have a black mark in your passport or in your immigration record. So, and, there is no shortage of people wanting to come to Hong Kong to work because it is perceived as a positive place to work in Asia for a migrant worker. And it is true.
Yes.
It is a positive place to work in Asia. So once you have overstayed your visa, you really spiral into a world with very few options. And returning home is your ultimate obligation. If you can continue with your job and have the baby and have maternity leave and those sort of things, well then that's an obvious path there. Now what some women tend to fall into is that they overstay their visa. The father of the child is an asylum seeker or a torture claimant in Hong Kong. And so they think, well, if he's a torture claimant and that's the father, and I can't take the baby home because, it's mixed race, I will apply for asylum or become a torture claimant in Hong Kong. And once they've gotten into that system, then the government has an obligation to support them through the time it takes to process that claim.
Right.
And regardless
of
the fact, the fact is, they will not be successful. There's only ever been one successful torture claim in Hong Kong and not that many more refugees.
Right.
And because they entered Hong Kong willingly and they weren't fleeing a country, from persecution or something like that, it's going to be very hard to prove that they're actually thrown out of their country or they ran from their country.
I mean, they come to you seeking help and they know they're not legal here, but you're providing a support.
So if they have made a torture claim, they will receive support from the government, and that'll be rental assistance, food drops, and all that sort of stuff.
But for the others?
And for the others, and for those particular people, we will always offer education and crisis response, basically. And we will make sure that any child in Hong Kong, regardless of who the mother is and what the circumstances are, that they get a birth certificate. And
How do you do that?
We just take them to the birth registry and go and walk through the whole system.
Is it that simple?
Well, no, it's never that simple. That's why we need very patient case managers.
It's hopeful.
It's very hopeful, yes. And we believe, they need to at least have a birth certificate.
Right.
And then we can work with the Indonesian consulate or the Philippines consulate to make sure that they can get that birth certificate into the transaction that needs to be in another country. So it'll be another certificate.
A lot of system,
a lot of talking with different organisations. But for the ones who don't make torture claims and do overstay their visa, ultimately they need to leave Hong Kong. They need to take their children away from Hong Kong. So we We have that in our mission statement.
Right.
You know, we want them to go home with dignity.
But these kids, though, it comes back to the kids for me because it's the future. You know,
Yes.
the adults, they can go off and do whatever. But what happens? They're stuck here. Even if they get a birth certificate, they go to a local school here. They go to, I don't know what. What
they
do
don't
they
get to go to local schools because unless their mother's working here, they won't be here by the time they're 6. There's no way they can survive here unless they're illegal, and then the child will not survive physically in Hong Kong if it doesn't have a mother that's capable of supporting it.
I'm sure there are lots of illegal immigrants.
There are, and there are many permutations, combinations. There are some people that have relationships with Hong Kong residents and therefore just live with the father or whatever. But unfortunately, more often than not, they get into relationships which are quite abusive. And that's a whole can of worms that you can talk about in another program.
Okay.
Because it's an illness, ultimately. And you can see how the illness started because there was desperation. And, you know, even this 12-year-old girl, I mean, the mother was in an abusive relationship. The mother had abused the child before. I mean, it just... You find when you find these clusters of people, and there are clusters around Hong Kong, that the layers of issues just escalate, and you can't even fathom the fact that you can imagine if you were pregnant and yet you're in an abusive relationship and you lost your job that day and you couldn't tell your family and, you know, where does it stop?
Exactly.
And so this is where suicide comes from. This is where thinking about how to abort that baby on your own comes from. And this is where very stupid things through uninformed decisions, really.
Right. Okay, to spin it up, though, what do you hope to achieve with PathFinders, and what kind of support do you need in order to move that direction?
We really want people to understand that migrant children born in Hong Kong matter. They really, truly matter. They are not they're not to be hidden in society. They're not to be ignored. They need to be supported. Their mothers need to understand what their rights are and what their obligations are, and that they can go home with dignity, and that Hong Kong maintains its reputation as a good place for these people to come and work. And so the whole spectrum of building up the mother's, her self-esteem and her ability to think that she can raise that child, or if she can't raise that child, to be happy with her choice to adopt that child in Hong Kong. But either way, that she doesn't come away from this thinking that she had no support, and that Hong Kong comes away from this thinking that it's helped its most vulnerable people to basically find their path home. And that's what we want to do.
I want to leave it at that, because it's a path. And we're
PathFinders.
Exactly. Yeah. What is your website again, so people can...
our website is www.pathfinders... pathfinders.org.hk. And we also have a hotline number.
Good.
So you could call if you know anyone that's pregnant, if you are pregnant yourself and you're a migrant worker, or if you want to volunteer with us, or you want to give us funding to support our programs or anything. The first point of call is our hotline, which is 5190-4886. And again, that number is on our website, which is pathfinders.org.hk.
Good girl.
5190-4886.
Excellent.
Thank you so much, Crystal.
Thank you. Wishing you all the luck with all these projects.